Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Texas history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing where these documented stories reach and at what times of day or night. The year was 1879, a time when the Texas frontier was still raw and untamed. The great cattle drives to northern markets had established vital economic roots, while the recent memory of war and Reconstruction remained etched in the weathered faces of settlers. The railroad was pushing westward, bringing with it both prosperity and strangers, many with intentions as dusty and obscured as the horizon itself. In Lockhart County, a small settlement some 30 miles east of San Antonio, there stood a weathered two-story farmhouse set back from the main road, partially obscured by a stand of pecan trees that had been there since before any white man had claimed the land. The property belonged to a woman known to locals as Widow Ravenna, though few could recall her given name or when exactly she had arrived. What most remembered was that she appeared shortly after the drought of '76, purchasing the abandoned homestead with gold coins, unusual for a lone woman in those days. The transaction was handled through a lawyer in San Antonio, a man who himself disappeared not long after the papers were signed. The locals knew little about her past. Some said she had come from Louisiana, others claimed Georgia. A few whispered Virginia, citing her refined manner and the quality of her possessions. What they did know was that she kept mostly to herself, venturing into town only when necessary for supplies. She was neither young nor particularly old, perhaps in her early 40s, with copper-colored hair always pulled tightly back, and eyes that folks described as knowing. She spoke with the faintest trace of an accent that no one could quite place, something not quite Southern, yet not Northern either, foreign perhaps, but impossible to identify. Ambrose Decker, who ran the general store, recalled how she would arrive precisely at 10 in the morning on the first Monday of each month. Always paid in coin, he later testified, never paper money, always gold or silver. And she bought the strangest collection of goods, salt by the pound, unusual spices I had to special order from San Antonio, jars and bottles of every size. When I asked once what she needed so many containers for, she just smiled and said, "A woman must preserve what she can in this world, Mr. Decker." The farmhouse itself had once belonged to the Whitaker family, who had abandoned it after 3 seasons of failed crops. Local lore held that the land was cursed. The soil had turned from fertile to barren, seemingly overnight during the summer of '73. The Whitakers' youngest son had disappeared that same summer, lost in the woods beyond the creek, they said. His body was never found, though searchers combed the area for weeks. The family left before winter set in, leaving behind most of their possessions in their haste to escape what the Mrs. Whitaker called a shadow that hangs over the land. Yet within months of Widow Ravenna's arrival, the garden behind the house flourished with vegetation so vibrant it seemed almost unnatural. Tomato vines climbed trellises with unusual vigor. Herbs sprouted in perfect rows, and peculiar vegetables unknown to local farmers grew in abundance. When questioned about her success where others had failed, the widow would shrug elegantly and say only, "The land responds to those who understand its nature." Widow Ravenna's property soon became known for 2 things: her remarkable garden that somehow thrived even during the driest months, and the occasional dinners she hosted for travelers passing through. In a time when hospitality was both a virtue and a necessity on the frontier, her invitations were not unusual, though some noted that her guests were always strangers, never locals. The widow would stand by the main road on certain evenings, particularly when the stagecoach was delayed or when solitary travelers appeared dusty and weary from their journeys. A hot meal and a proper bed for the night she would offer, her smile warm but her eyes calculating. No charge for the courtesy. Company is payment enough for a widow. Few refused such hospitality in a region where the next proper lodging might be half a day's ride away. Those who accepted found themselves ushered into a home that belied its weathered exterior. Inside, polished furniture, intricate tapestries, and silverware of unusual design suggested a life of former luxury. The widow's table was always set with fine china, a full service for 6, though she never hosted more than 1 or 2 guests at a time. Jeremiah Cooper, who drove the weekly mail coach, later recalled how the widow would watch her guests eat, barely touching her own plate. She'd smile when they commented on the flavor of the food, Cooper told Sheriff Thorne. Said she had her own special way of seasoning everything. Made me uneasy somehow, though I couldn't say why. I ate there only once and made excuses thereafter. The food was good. Better than good, in fact. Had dreams for a week after, vivid as anything. But there was something not quite right about the way she watched us eating. Like we were the meal, not the stew. Martha Jenkins, the widow's nearest neighbor, though still a good mile away, reported occasional sounds carrying across the fields at night, singing in a language she didn't recognize, and once what she thought might be screams, though she admitted it could have been a wildcat or coyotes. "I mind my own, Sheriff," she said, when questioned. "But I will say this. Since that woman moved in, nothing grows right on the land bordering hers. My south field used to give the best corn in the county. Now, the stalks come up stunted, if they come at all, and the smell when the wind blows from her direction, like something sweet gone bad." The incident that brought Sheriff Augustus Thorne to her door began with a stagecoach passenger who had fallen ill after leaving her table. The man, a cattle buyer named Harrison Mills, had stayed the night at the widow's home before continuing his journey toward San Antonio. By the time he reached the next stopover at Deauville, he was sweating profusely and complaining of stomach pain so severe he could barely stand. The station manager sent for the local doctor, but by nightfall, Mills was dead. Dr. Franklin Watkins, who attended Mills in his final hours, was troubled by what he witnessed. The symptoms resembled poisoning more than any disease he recognized, though he could not identify the specific cause. The man's skin had taken on a peculiar grayish hue. His pupils were so dilated they nearly swallowed the iris, and most disturbing of all, his final words made no sense, rambling about faces in the walls and something moving beneath the floorboards at the widow's house. When Dr. Watkins learned that Mills had dined at the Ravenna farm, his suspicion deepened. This was not the first traveler to fall mysteriously ill after visiting the widow. 2 months earlier, a land surveyor had died under similar circumstances in a boarding house in San Antonio, having passed through Lockhart County. And before that, a cattle drover had been found dead beside the road, his horse still saddled and waiting patiently nearby. "I've practiced medicine in these parts for 20 years, Watkins told the sheriff. "Seen every manner of death the frontier can offer. Fever, injury, snakebite, even a few poisonings when love or money turned sour. But this is different. The progression is too rapid, the symptoms too peculiar, and always men who've dined with the widow." Sheriff Thorne was a cautious man who had served Lockhart County for nearly 8 years. A veteran of the late war, he had seen enough death to last several lifetimes, and approached his duties with a methodical thoroughness that some mistook for coldness. His office in the county courthouse was sparse but orderly. A desk of solid oak, 2 straight-backed chairs, a gun rack, and a cabinet containing records dating back to the county's founding. When Dr. Watkins brought his concerns to the sheriff's office, Thorne listened carefully, making notes in the leather-bound ledger he kept on his desk. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the west-facing window, highlighting the doctor's agitated state as he paced the small room. 3 cases in 6 months, the doctor explained, all men who stayed with her, all with similar symptoms, but nothing I can prove conclusively. The sheriff nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing. "I'll look into it," was all he said. After the doctor left, Thorne sat alone in the gathering darkness, reviewing what he knew of Widow Ravenna. She had appeared during a time when many were passing through. The years after Reconstruction had seen a great migration in Texas as people sought new opportunities. A widow with means was not unheard of, though one who chose to live alone without family or servants was unusual. She paid her taxes promptly, attended church infrequently but respectably, and had never been the subject of any complaint or scandal. Yet something about the pattern troubled him. He pulled out the county death records for the past year and examined them more carefully. In addition to the 3 cases Watkins had mentioned, Thorne found 2 more that might fit. A peddler found dead in his wagon along the eastern county line, and an itinerant preacher who had died in his sleep at a farm near the widow's property. Both deaths had been attributed to natural causes, but neither man had shown signs of illness before their sudden demise. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, absently rubbing the old wound in his left shoulder that ached when rain was coming. 5 deaths, possibly connected to one woman. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence suggested a pattern too consistent to ignore. What would drive a seemingly respectable widow to poison travelers? Robbery seemed an unlikely motive. None of the dead men had been particularly wealthy, and their possessions had been found intact. Madness, perhaps? Or something darker? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Daisy Wells, the young woman who worked at the town's only cafe, stood hesitantly in the doorway. She was a shy girl, barely 20, and clearly uncomfortable to be at the sheriff's office after hours. "Pardon me, Sheriff," she said, twisting her apron in her hands. "I overheard you talking with the doctor earlier about the widow." Thorne gestured her to a seat. "What about her, Miss Wells?" Daisy perched on the edge of the chair, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "It's probably nothing, but I was picking blackberries along the creek last summer, near her property. I wasn't trespassing, just staying by the water. I saw her in her garden, only she wasn't planting or weeding. She was talking to the plants. Not like folks sometimes do, but like she was having a conversation. And the strangest thing, I could have sworn they were moving toward her, the vines and stalks bending like they were listening." The girl blushed, clearly expecting the sheriff to dismiss her story. "I know how it sounds. My mother says I have too much imagination. But there was something else, something I never told anyone. When she was done talking to the plants, she took something from her pocket and sprinkled it on the soil. It looked like ash, but darker. And where it fell, the ground seemed to ripple, like the surface of the creek when you throw in a stone." Thorne thanked her for the information, assuring her that he took all reports seriously. After she left, he added her account to his notes, though he wasn't sure what to make of it. Girls Daisy's age often did have active imaginations, yet there was a sincerity to her fear that gave him pause. Combined with the doctor's concerns and the pattern of deaths, it was enough to warrant further investigation. The following day, Sheriff Thorne rode out to the Ravenna property. It was early autumn, and the morning air carried a rare coolness that would burn away by midday. As he approached the house, he noted how well-maintained it appeared compared to neighboring farms. The garden particularly caught his eye, rows of vegetables and herbs, some familiar, others he couldn't name, all growing with unusual vigor in neat, almost geometric patterns. At the center stood a peculiar tree he had never seen before, its bark nearly black, its leaves a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the sunlight. Widow Ravenna received him on the wide front porch, offering coffee, which he politely declined. She wore a dark blue dress of simple cut but fine material, her hair arranged in its usual severe style. Up close, the sheriff noticed faint lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of age, yet her skin maintained a smoothness that seemed at odds with frontier living. "What brings the law to my door on such a fine morning?" she asked, her voice melodic but guarded. Thorne explained about Mills, watching her reaction carefully. She showed no surprise at his visit, answering his questions about the cattle buyer with appropriate concern but little detail. Yes, the gentleman had stayed the night. Yes, he seemed in perfect health when he left. No, she couldn't recall exactly what she had served for dinner, just the usual fare for guests. "I prepare what the garden provides," she added with a slight smile. Nothing fancy, but travelers seemed to appreciate a home-cooked meal. It was when he asked to see her kitchen that something changed in her demeanor, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. Nevertheless, she led him inside without protest, moving through the front parlor where heavy curtains kept the morning light at bay. The interior of the house felt unnaturally still and cool. Thorne noted the unusual furnishings, pieces that seemed out of place in a frontier home. A lacquered cabinet of Asian design stood against one wall, beside it a bookshelf containing volumes in several languages. On a side table sat a collection of small carved figurines, their features distorted in ways that made the sheriff look away quickly. "You've traveled widely," he commented, gesturing to the exotic items. "My late husband was a merchant," she replied. "We spent many years abroad before settling in America." "And when did he pass?" A shadow crossed her face. 10 years ago this winter. Illness took him quite suddenly." The kitchen was immaculate and surprisingly modern. A large cast-iron stove dominated one wall, beside it shelves lined with jars of preserved foods and dried herbs. What caught the sheriff's attention was a small locked cabinet above the dry sink. When he inquired about it, the widow explained it contained special seasonings she had brought from back east. "Cooking is my one pleasure, Sheriff," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A woman alone finds comfort where she can." Thorne asked casual questions about her background, learning little he hadn't already heard. She had been widowed some years ago and had come to Texas seeking a fresh start. She mentioned travels in Europe and Asia in her youth and an interest in the culinary arts, as she called them. When he inquired about her unusual garden, her expression brightened with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "I've always had a way with growing things," she said. "Some might call it a gift. The soil here responded well to my methods." "And what methods might those be?" Thorne asked. The widow's smile remained fixed. "Every gardener has her secrets, Sheriff." Before leaving, Thorne asked if he might trouble her for a glass of water. When she stepped away to fetch it, he quickly examined the locked cabinet, noting its unusual construction. The wood was foreign, possibly teak, and the lock itself appeared to be made of silver rather than the more common iron or brass. Widow Ravenna returned with the water, and Thorne could have sworn her eyes flicked toward the cabinet as if checking that it remained secure. He thanked her for her time and departed more unsettled than when he had arrived. As he rode back toward town, the sheriff found himself glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. At one point, he thought he glimpsed movement among the trees that bordered the widow's property, something dark and fluid moving against the wind. But when he reined in his horse and turned to look directly, nothing was there except shadows and the rustling of leaves. The sheriff left without finding anything conclusive, but his unease remained. Over the following weeks he made discreet inquiries about similar cases in neighboring counties. What he discovered disturbed him deeply. There had been at least 5 other mysterious deaths along the main routes between Houston and San Antonio over the past 2 years, all male travelers, all with symptoms resembling those of Mills. More troubling was what he learned when he telegraphed authorities in Georgia and Louisiana about a widow matching Ravenna's description. From Savannah came word of a Cordelia Blackwood whose husband and brother-in-law had died suddenly of stomach ailments in '74. The bereaved wife had sold their plantation shortly thereafter and disappeared. From New Orleans, news of a similar case involving a woman who had left the city after her second husband's unexpected death. Both descriptions matched the widow, now living in Lockhart County. Most disturbing was the response from a physician in Charleston who had treated a family poisoned at dinner in '72. The host, a woman whose name he had forgotten, had fled before authorities could question her. "I recall most vividly," the doctor wrote, "that several of her garden plants were of varieties I had never before encountered, despite my interest in botanical medicine." Sheriff Thorne was not a man given to superstition or jumping to conclusions. He needed evidence, not coincidences. His opportunity came when a traveling salesman named Holcomb arrived in town and mentioned he had been invited to dine at the hospitable widow's home that very evening. Holcomb was a rotund, jovial man who sold patent medicines and tonics throughout the region. He had encountered the widow on the road while his wagon was mired in mud, and she had offered him dinner and lodging while his horse rested. The sheriff saw his chance. He enlisted Holcomb's cooperation, instructing him to save a portion of everything served and to make note of anything unusual. The salesman, intrigued rather than alarmed by the sheriff's concerns, agreed readily. "I've dined with all sorts in my travels," Holcomb said with a wink. "I've developed quite the iron stomach, but I'll keep my eyes open, Sheriff. Consider me your deputy for the evening." Thorne offered him a small glass vial for food samples and a warning, "Don't eat anything that tastes strange, no matter how she urges you, and if you feel unwell, make an excuse and leave immediately. I'll be waiting at the old mill down the road." Holcomb departed with a confident wave, his wagon creaking under the weight of his merchandise and his considerable frame. The sheriff watched him go with a growing sense of foreboding. Perhaps he shouldn't have involved the salesman, but he needed evidence, and Holcomb had seemed the ideal candidate, experienced, observant, and already invited to the widow's table. As dusk approached, Thorne positioned himself at the abandoned mill, a quarter-mile from the Ravenna property. From this vantage point, he could observe the road without being seen. Hours passed with no sign of the salesman. The sheriff's concern deepened as the moon rose and the night grew colder. Surely dinner would have concluded by now. Had Holcomb forgotten their arrangement, or had something prevented his departure? Just before midnight, Thorne made his decision. He would approach the house on foot, avoiding the main road, and assess the situation. Leaving his horse tethered at the mill, he moved silently through the fields, keeping to the shadows as he neared the Ravenna property. The house was still illuminated, warm light spilling from the downstairs windows. As the sheriff crept closer, he heard voices, Holcomb's jovial tone, and the widow's softer responses. They appeared to be in the parlor, based on the position of the light. Thorne moved carefully around the side of the house, seeking a vantage point where he might observe without being seen. Through a gap in the curtains, he could just make out the two figures seated before the fireplace. Holcomb was gesturing expansively, his face flushed, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The widow sat opposite him, her posture perfect, a slight smile playing about her lips as she listened. Nothing in the scene suggested danger or distress. Thorne was considering whether to withdraw when he noticed something odd about Holcomb's movements. The salesman's gestures, initially animated, had become sluggish, almost dreamlike. His head would occasionally loll forward before he jerked it upright again. Even from a distance, the sheriff could see that his pupils were unnaturally dilated, his gaze unfocused. Just as Thorne was about to intervene, the widow rose gracefully and moved to stand behind Holcomb's chair. She placed her hands on his shoulders, leaning down to whisper something in his ear. The salesman's expression changed, fear briefly crossing his features before being replaced by a blank acquiescence. With the widow guiding him, he rose unsteadily to his feet and allowed her to lead him from the room toward what Thorne presumed was the kitchen or back of the house. The sheriff moved quickly around the building, seeking another window through which to observe. He found one at the rear, the kitchen dimly lit by a single lamp. Inside, he could see Holcomb seated at the table, his back to the window. The widow moved around him, preparing something at the counter. She was speaking, though Thorne could not hear the words through the glass. What happened next would be recorded in Sheriff Thorne's own journal, later found among his personal effects. Holcomb, seemingly responding to the widow's instructions, began to remove his jacket and waistcoat. His movements were mechanical, like those of a puppet on strings. The widow approached him with something in her hand, a small bowl containing a dark substance. She dipped her fingers into it and drew symbols on Holcomb's exposed forearms, all while continuing to speak in what the sheriff later described as a language unlike any I have encountered, with cadences that seemed to distort the very air. Thorne knew he should intervene immediately, but something held him back, a combination of disbelief at what he was witnessing and a strange lethargy that seemed to seep into his limbs as the widow's chant continued. He found himself unable to move, watching in horrified fascination as she completed the markings on Holcomb's arms, and then took up a slender silver instrument from the table, something like a narrow spoon or scoop. What followed was so beyond Thorne's experience that his journal entry becomes fragmented and contradictory at this point. He described the widow directing Holcomb to extend his arm over a larger bowl, then using the silver instrument to extract something from beneath his skin that moved with unusual properties. The salesman showed no signs of pain, his face blank as the procedure continued. The sheriff's paralysis broke only when the widow turned suddenly toward the window, as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, hers widening in surprise and then narrowing with something like recognition. Thorne stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to retreat. He made his way back to the mill in a state of confusion, his thoughts scattered, his pulse racing. The remainder of the night passed in anxious vigilance. Thorne remained at the mill, watching the road, expecting either Holcomb to appear or the widow to flee. Neither occurred. The lights in the house were extinguished one by one until only darkness remained. By first light, the sheriff had collected himself enough to form a plan. He would return to town, gather several reliable men, and come back with a proper warrant to search the premises. Whatever he had witnessed, whether real or some trick of shadow and exhaustion, needed to be investigated through official channels. Holcomb never returned to town that night. When Thorne rode out to the Ravenna farm the following morning, he found the salesman's wagon still there, but no sign of the man himself. The widow explained that he had taken ill during dinner, and she had put him up in the guest room. But when she went to check on him at dawn, he was gone. Perhaps he felt better and walked to town, she suggested. Some men don't like to admit weakness. Her manner was as composed as ever, but Thorne noticed a tension in her movements, a wariness in her gaze. When he mentioned that Holcomb had left his wagon and merchandise behind, unlikely for a traveling salesman, the widow merely shrugged. "I cannot account for another's behavior, Sheriff. I offered hospitality and nothing more." The sheriff insisted on searching the property. In the guest room he found Holcomb's valise, but no other signs of the man. The bed appeared unused. When he examined the barn, he noted fresh dirt on a shovel leaning against the wall and what looked like blood spatters, already dried, on the wooden handle. It was in the root cellar beneath the kitchen that Sheriff Thorne made his most disturbing discovery, though what exactly he found was never officially documented. His journal entry, written that evening, mentioned only evidence of the widow's true nature and his intention to return the next day with a warrant and men to assist in a proper search. The entry continued. "I have seen things today that defy explanation. The cellar walls are inscribed with symbols unlike any language I recognize. Beneath the main storage area, I discovered a false floor concealing a smaller chamber. The odor emanating from within suggested decay, yet what I glimpsed inside appeared to be moving. I closed it quickly, overcome by a sensation I have not felt since the worst days at Shiloh, a certainty that I was in the presence of something profoundly wrong." The sheriff's journal then detailed his plan to return with reinforcements, noting, "Whatever evil resides in that house, it has claimed too many already." The initial assumption was that he had suffered a heart seizure, but Dr. Watkins, upon examining the body, noted symptoms alarmingly similar to those of Harrison Mills and the others: the gray pallor, the dilated pupils, and, most telling, a peculiar odor on his breath that the doctor likened to almonds, but somehow wrong. Most disturbing of all was what the doctor discovered during a more thorough examination: a series of small puncture marks on the sheriff's forearms, arranged in patterns that corresponded to no medical procedure Watkins had ever encountered. It must be exposed to the light of day and eradicated. He never had the chance. Sheriff Augustus Thorne was found the following morning by a local farmer, slumped over his horse a mile from the Ravenna property. When the marks were pressed, they exuded a clear fluid that when examined under the doctor's crude microscope, contained minute particulates of a crystalline nature, similar in appearance to certain mineral salts, yet behaving in a manner suggesting unusual properties. By the time a group of townsmen organized themselves to visit the widow's farm, they found the house empty, the kitchen stripped of its jars and supplies. Only the garden remained, now looking somehow sinister in its abandoned state, the plants too vibrant, too healthy for the parched earth of that Texas autumn. Several men reported feeling lightheaded merely from the scent of the herbs growing there. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing findings beneath the recently turned soil of the barn floor, though accounts differ on exactly what was unearthed. Some reports mention human remains, others only personal effects of missing travelers. The county clerk's official record states only that items of concern were discovered and properly disposed of, while newspaper accounts from neighboring towns refer vaguely to evidence of foul play. One member of the search party, Franklin Reed, later confided to his son a more detailed account. According to Reed, they found not one but 3 sets of remains beneath the barn floor. "Wasn't like any burial I ever saw," he reportedly said. "The bodies were arranged somehow, positioned in a pattern, with those same strange markings the doctor found on the sheriff carved into the dirt around them. And the worst part was they didn't look complete, like something had been removed from each one, something more than just their possessions." Reed's account was never officially recorded and was dismissed by authorities as the embellishment of a man known for his fondness for whiskey and tall tales. Yet certain details, the arrangement of the bodies, the markings in the soil, aligned too closely with the sheriff's final journal entries to be coincidental. What is certain is that authorities were sufficiently troubled to issue alerts to law enforcement across Texas and neighboring states describing the widow and warning of her dangerous and possibly deranged nature. Perhaps most unsettling were the contents of the locked cabinet in her kitchen, finally forced open during the investigation. Inside were dozens of small vials containing powders and dried matter of unknown origin, labeled with symbols that matched those found in the cellar. When samples were sent to a university in Houston for identification, the professor who examined them reportedly wrote back, "I cannot identify with certainty the contents provided. However, I can state with confidence that several appear to be derived from plants not native to North America, and possessing properties that, in sufficient quantity, would produce symptoms consistent with those described." The professor's letter, preserved in county archives, continued with an observation that officials deemed too speculative to include in the official report. Of particular concern is compound marked with a crescent symbol. Under microscopic examination, it appears to contain spores of a fungal nature unknown to botanical science. When a small amount was introduced to a laboratory animal, the creature exhibited signs of extreme agitation followed by a docility bordering on catatonia. Before expiring, it consumed portions of its own limbs without any apparent sensation of pain. The most curious detail, one that has never been satisfactorily explained, concerned the contents of the widow's garden. Among the more common vegetables and herbs were several plants that botanists later identified as extremely rare specimens, some thought to exist only in remote regions of Asia and Africa. How they came to flourish in the harsh Texas soil remains unknown. What is known is that after the property was abandoned, efforts to cultivate the land failed repeatedly. The soil, once so fertile under the widow's care, seemed to have turned barren, as though poisoned by whatever had grown there before. In the weeks following the widow's disappearance, reports trickled in from surrounding counties of a woman matching her description. A shopkeeper in a small town near the Louisiana border recalled selling supplies to such a woman, who paid with unusual foreign coins. A station master farther north remembered a solitary female passenger who carried with her a collection of herb jars and botanical specimens. Each sighting led nowhere, the trail growing colder as autumn deepened into winter. Then came the disturbing case of the Garrett homestead. In early December of that year, a family of settlers living in an isolated cabin some 80 miles north of Lockhart reported offering shelter to a middle-aged woman during a severe storm. The woman, who gave her name as Margaret, repaid their kindness by preparing dinner from supplies in her own traveling bags. By morning, all 5 family members were dead, their bodies discovered by a neighbor who had come to warn them of Apache movements in the area. The description of Margaret matched that of Widow Ravenna in every particular. The neighbor, a seasoned frontiersman named Clayton Burr, reported findings consistent with those at the Ravenna farm: strange markings on the victim's arms, a peculiar arrangement of the bodies, and, most disturbing, evidence that some procedure had been performed on each corpse before the perpetrator fled. "It wasn't like anything I've seen before," Burr told the county marshal, "and I've seen plenty out here. Apache raids, Mexican bandits, all manner of frontier justice. This was something else entirely. Something deliberate, like they were used for a purpose that had nothing to do with robbery or revenge." No trace of the widow was ever found after the Garrett incident. Some claimed sightings in Louisiana the following spring, others in a mining town in Colorado years later. The most persistent rumor placed her in Arizona territory by 1881, where a similar pattern of hospitable widow and missing travelers emerged briefly before disappearing again. What remains are the questions that haunt this case to the present day. Who was the woman who called herself Widow Ravenna? What purpose lay behind her methodical poisoning of travelers? The prevailing theory among officials at the time suggested she was simply a murderer who robbed her victims, perhaps deranged by grief or driven by some unfathomable compulsion. Yet certain elements defy such simple explanation. No significant valuables were ever found in her possession. The careful selection of victims, always male travelers, always alone, suggests a pattern more deliberate than mere opportunity. And then there are the botanical anomalies, the strange garden that flourished against all natural expectations, the compounds that could not be identified by the scientific knowledge of the day. Some speculated that the widow belonged to some obscure cult or secret society. The symbols found in her cellar bore vague resemblance to certain occult markings documented in European witch trials of previous centuries. Others suggested she might have been a practitioner of voodoo or some other form of folk magic brought from the Caribbean. A visiting ethnologist who examined copies of the cellar markings claimed they resembled certain tribal symbols from remote regions of Africa, where, he noted, botanical knowledge of toxic substances far exceeds our own medical understanding. The journal of Sheriff Thorne, discovered among his effects after his death, offers perhaps the most disturbing perspective. In an entry dated 3 days before his fatal visit to the Ravenna farm, he wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that what we face is not merely a criminal matter, but something altogether more sinister. The pattern of deaths, the foreign plants, the strange symbols, they suggest a purpose beyond mere murder. I am reminded of stories my grandmother told, brought from the old country, of those who sought communion with forces beyond mortal understanding through the preparation of certain concoctions requiring human essence. God help us if such practices have found their way to our shores." In a final entry, written the night before his death, the sheriff added a detail that officials deliberately omitted from public records. "What I witnessed in that kitchen defies rational explanation. The widow was not merely killing her guests, she was harvesting something from them. The procedure I observed being performed on Holcomb involved the extraction of a substance I cannot name or describe, except to say that it moved with a vitality of its own and emitted a faint luminescence when transferred to her collection vessel. Whatever she is accumulating, it is something carried within the living body, something that cannot be taken from the dead. This explains the careful preparation of her victims, the special meals, the marked patterns on their skin. She is farming them, preparing the soil of their bodies to yield a crop I dare not imagine." The official investigation concluded with the widow's disappearance, the case filed away as an unsolved series of murders. Yet certain aspects continued to trouble those involved. Dr. Watkins, who had examined the bodies of both Mills and Sheriff Thorne, eventually left his practice and devoted the remainder of his life to the study of exotic toxins and their effects on the human body. His correspondence with medical authorities in Europe and Asia suggests he was searching for something specific, a substance or technique, that could explain what he had witnessed in Lockhart County. In his final published paper presented to a medical society in Philadelphia in 1885, Watkins proposed a theory of botanical parasitism that was dismissed by his colleagues as fantastical. He suggested the existence of certain plant species that had evolved to form a symbiotic relationship with human hosts, using chemical compounds to alter behavior and physiology. These organisms, he wrote, may manipulate their hosts to create optimal conditions for their own reproduction, much as certain fungi induce ants to position themselves ideally before death. The implications for human society are profound, particularly if such species have been deliberately cultivated and their effects refined over generations. Watkins died under mysterious circumstances shortly after presenting his paper, his body discovered in his hotel room with symptoms remarkably similar to those of Harrison Mills. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but those familiar with the Lockhart case noted the coincidence with alarm. In the decades that followed, the story of Widow Ravenna gradually faded from official records, surviving mainly in local folklore. The house itself burned down in the late 1890s, removing the last physical reminder of what had occurred there. Yet even today, that stretch of land remains uncultivated, passed over by farmers who claim the soil just doesn't feel right. Occasional archaeological surveys in the area have yielded curious findings: fragments of unusual pottery, small stone carvings of indeterminate origin, and most recently, in 2003, a sealed glass vial containing residue that, when analyzed with modern techniques, was found to contain compounds derived from plants now extinct or known only in certain isolated regions of Central Africa. Perhaps most chilling are the accounts that continue to emerge from travelers along the old road that passes the former Ravenna property. Reports of a solitary female figure seen at dusk, standing motionless among the pecan trees. Strange dreams afflicting those who camp nearby, dreams of elaborate meals served by a copper-haired hostess whose smile never reaches her eyes. And most disturbing, the occasional disappearance of solitary hikers or campers in the area, usually dismissed as accidents or the result of wildlife encounters. Local historian Miriam Calloway, who has spent years researching the Ravenna case, offers perhaps the most unsettling theory. What if she never left at all? What if whatever sustained her unusual garden, whatever powered those strange compounds, required her to remain tied to that land in some fashion? The human mind recoils from such possibilities, yet the pattern of disappearances in that area has never truly ceased. As for what exactly was served at the widow's table, that remains a matter of speculation. Dr. Watkins, in his final report on the deaths, wrote only, "Whatever these men consumed in their final meal, it was something beyond my knowledge to name." Perhaps it is better that way. In a later private letter to a colleague in Houston, however, he was more forthcoming. The contents of the stomach were unlike anything I have encountered in 20 years of medical practice. Partially digested food, yes, but interspersed with matter that appeared almost crystalline in structure. Most disturbing were the small dark particles that, when isolated, seemed to move of their own accord under the microscope. I destroyed my samples after observation, feeling an irrational but profound revulsion at their very existence. What became of the widow's special seasonings, those carefully preserved vials and jars she had cultivated with such care? Some suggest they found their way into other kitchens, other hands. A series of unusual poisonings in New Orleans in 1885 bore striking similarities to the Ravenna cases. A traveling medicine show operating in Kansas and Nebraska in the early 1890s sold tinctures and elixirs containing exotic Eastern herbs that reportedly caused vivid hallucinations in those who consumed them. The final documented reference to what might have been Widow Ravenna comes from a territorial prison report in Arizona dated 1887. A woman arrested for attempting to poison the governor at a public dinner was found hanging in her cell before trial. Her personal effects, inventoried before disposal, included various dried herbs of unknown type and a small book written in a cipher that was never decoded. The description of the prisoner matches what Widow Ravenna would have looked like after several years. A woman in her early 50s with graying copper hair and unusual amber eyes. The prison report includes one final detail that links this woman to the Texas case. Among her possessions was a silver locket containing a tightly folded paper. When carefully opened, it revealed a hand-drawn map of Lockhart County, with the location of the Ravenna farm marked by a small symbol identical to those found in the cellar of the abandoned house. In Lockhart County today, few remember the story of the woman who fed her guests what the sheriff couldn't identify. The old farmhouse site has been reclaimed by nature, the pecan trees grown massive and twisted with age. Occasionally, travelers along the old road report a strange sensation when passing that particular stretch, a sudden chill, an inexplicable scent of cooking spices on the wind, a momentary dizziness that passes as quickly as it comes. Some claim to have seen lights moving among the trees at night, as though someone were carrying a lantern from room to long-vanished room. Others report dreams of being invited to dine at a table set with fine china, the hostess's face always obscured in shadow. Those who experience such visions often report waking with a peculiar taste in their mouth, something like almonds, but somehow wrong. Local authorities dismiss such accounts as the natural embellishment of an old tragedy, the human tendency to weave supernatural elements into historical events. Yet they cannot explain why, every few years, another solitary traveler vanishes in the vicinity of the old Ravenna property, leaving behind only footprints that lead into the stand of ancient pecan trees and never reemerge. Perhaps it is merely coincidence, or the dangers that any isolated rural area presents. Or perhaps something of Widow Ravenna remains, bound to the land she cultivated so unnaturally, still seeking guests for her table, still serving dishes whose ingredients no sheriff could identify. The most recent disappearance occurred just last summer. A graduate student researching frontier history who had mentioned to colleagues his interest in the Ravenna case. His abandoned car was found along the old road, his research materials scattered as if dropped in haste. Among his papers was a curious note, apparently written shortly before his disappearance. Making progress. Local woman offered information about R, invited to dinner to discuss. Strange coincidence, she has copper hair. No trace of the student has ever been found. The investigation remains open, another unsolved mystery in a region that has accumulated many over the years. And sometimes, locals say, on particularly still nights, a light can be seen moving among the trees where the house once stood, as though someone were carrying a lantern from room to long-vanished room, perhaps preparing the table for guests who will never arrive. Or perhaps they do, and we simply don't hear from them afterward. If you find yourself traveling through Lockhart County, along that old road past the stand of pecan trees, you might notice the peculiar vibrance of the wildflowers that grow there, somehow more vivid than those in neighboring fields. You might catch an unfamiliar scent on the breeze, something like cooking spices but with an underlying note that raises the hair on your neck. And if you should see a copper-haired woman standing by the roadside at dusk, offering hospitality and a home-cooked meal, perhaps it would be wiser to politely decline and continue on your way. Some invitations once accepted cannot be escaped. Some flavors once tasted remain with you forever. Some hungers once awakened can never be satisfied. The case of Widow Ravenna remains officially unsolved. The full truth of what occurred in that farmhouse in 1879 lost to time and deliberate obscurity. Yet the pattern she established, the isolated location, The unusual garden, the mysterious seasonings, the vanished travelers, continues to echo through similar cases across the decades, suggesting that whatever knowledge she possessed did not die with her, but was passed on, preserved like one of her carefully bottled concoctions, waiting for the right moment to be uncorked once again. For in the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the widow's story is not what she did, but the possibility that she was merely one practitioner of a tradition that stretches back centuries and continues to the present day. Those who know the secret of preparing dishes, whose ingredients no sheriff could identify, and whose effects no doctor could cure.